There are structures that have stood for thousands of years, silent beneath the desert sun, yet always whispering something to the wind. The Great Pyramid of Giza, a shape too perfect amidst the chaos of human history, still leaves us with questions that never find their answers. Who built it? Why was such precision necessary, as if it were designed by modern engineering? And why have the clearest pieces of evidence never truly emerged? Were the ancient Egyptians truly master engineers? Or are we witnessing the legacy of another civilization, a mind that has been erased from humanity's memory? Tonight, let us begin a journey that unfolds slowly but pulls us deep. A passage through the dusty veils of time, listening to secrets long buried and questioning the truths we thought we knew. Welcome to Deformed History. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The stars over Giza do not move. They watch. Night after night, century after century, they hover in silence above the desert sands, casting their cold gaze upon the stone giants that defy time. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, massive, austere, and ancient, stands as if it had always been there. But has it? It is said that the Egyptians built it during the 4th dynasty, over 4,000 years ago, that they aligned it perfectly with cardinal directions, carved it with copper tools, and moved millions of limestone blocks without wheels, iron, or pulleys, it is said. But belief is a fragile thing, isn't it? Built on repetition, not certainty. What if that story was never true? What if the builders were not the people we thought? And what if someone, or something, wanted us never to ask? In 1858, British explorer John Taylor noticed something strange. He wasn't an archaeologist, just a man with a telescope and a curiosity sharpened by stillness. He observed that the sides of the Great Pyramid aligned not just roughly, but with eerie precision, to the 4 cardinal points of the Earth: true north, true south, true east, and true west. Modern instruments confirmed he was right. The orientation is accurate to within 3/60ths of a degree. Even today, we cannot replicate that easily. GPS can guide us, but in the age of stone and silence, what could guide them? The pyramid is also placed at the exact center of all landmass on Earth. Not close. Exact. If you draw lines of longitude and latitude, intersecting at equidistant points across continents and seas, you will find that Giza is, uncannily, the geodetic center of Earth's land surface. How could an ancient civilization, without satellites or maps, know where that was? Historians often skip this or wave it away. They say it's coincidence or numerology. They say the Egyptians must have just gotten lucky. But how many times can luck be repeated before it becomes intent? We are told the pyramid was a tomb. That's the official story. And yet, no body has ever been found inside. No inscriptions, no sarcophagus, nothing in the king's chamber to suggest it was ever meant to hold the dead. Just a stone box, a granite container, larger than any hallway leading into the pyramid, which means it was placed there before the pyramid was built around it. But why? Its dimensions are also curious. If you take the height of the pyramid and multiply it by 40 through 200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. If you take the perimeter of its base and apply the same factor, you get the Earth's equatorial circumference. These are numbers we've only confirmed in the modern age with satellites and radar. Were the ancient Egyptians also measuring the Earth to such cosmic accuracy? The number 43,200 is not random. It belongs to the precession of the equinoxes, an astronomical cycle that spans 25,920 years, and 43,200 is precisely 1,656 times 26. These numbers form the foundation of ancient timekeeping across Mesopotamia, India, and even the Mayan world. Was someone trying to encode the language of the heavens in stone? The official stance says no. But then, the official stance also said the Earth was flat once, and that Galileo was a heretic. Sometimes, what we're told to believe is not there to explain, but to control. There is something else, something unsettling: the erosion on the Sphinx. Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, examined the body of the Sphinx in the early 1990s. He wasn't searching for secrets, just curious about weathering. But what he found didn't align with the story. The Sphinx shows signs of water erosion, deep vertical channels along the flanks, carved by prolonged heavy rainfall. Not wind, not sand, but water. The last time that region received such rains, between 7,000 and 10,000 BCE, that is long before the rise of dynastic Egypt. Centuries before agriculture even began along the Nile. Schoch presented his findings at the Geological Society of America, and geologists agreed. The erosion didn't match the arid conditions of Egypt in 2500 BCE. Yet Egyptologists dismissed it outright. They said, it must be an anomaly. But what if it wasn't? What if the Sphinx and the pyramids were not built by the Egyptians at all, but inherited? What if those structures are remnants of something much older, something erased? Because if we allow that possibility, we open a door, one that leads not just into the past, but into the unknown. Ancient texts hint at it, obliquely. In the Westcar Papyrus, there's mention of secret chambers under the pyramids, rooms that house scrolls from before the Great Flood. Herodotus, the Greek historian, once wrote that priests told him of underground passages beneath the Giza complex. He was laughed at, but in 2017, a team using muon detectors discovered a vast void inside the Great Pyramid, a space at least 100 feet long, sitting above the Grand Gallery, unentered, undisturbed, unexplained. What lies in that silence? No excavation has yet entered it. Official channels say it is difficult, dangerous. Perhaps it is. But perhaps it is also something else. A refusal, a boundary drawn not by rock, but by fear, or by agenda. And here, a more troubling idea surfaces. What if there is a reason we're not allowed to know? What if certain truths must remain buried, not by time, but by decision? Who decides what gets unearthed? Who funds the digs? Who writes the textbooks? Who controls the museums? In 1954, a solar boat was discovered buried beside the Great Pyramid, dismantled, perfectly preserved, never meant to sail. Some called it a ritual relic, but others noticed something else. The wood, when tested, appeared thousands of years older than the official date of the pyramid. That detail was quietly footnoted, then forgotten. We are told history is fact, but is it? Or is it something far more fragile, shaped not by evidence but by omission? The desert doesn't speak, but it remembers. And in the wind that curls around ancient stone, there is something like a whisper, faint, incomplete, waiting to be heard. What else has been erased? There's a strange silence that lingers over knowledge too ancient to catalogue. It isn't the silence of time or of distance. It's a deeper quiet, the kind that surrounds things deliberately forgotten. Between the pages of dusty records and beneath the foundations of accepted truth, we begin to notice the outline of something that was never meant to be named. If the pyramids were not built by the Egyptians, then who left them behind? And why do we know so little about them? In 1984, an unassuming engineer named Christopher Dunn published his observations about the Great Pyramid, not as a historian, but as a machinist. What he saw was not a tomb, it was precision, the kind of precision he had only ever seen in manufacturing plants, not in funerary monuments. Dunn measured the internal dimensions of the king's chamber and found tolerances within fractions of an inch, across granite blocks weighing dozens of tons. Some were smooth to a degree rivaling modern optical lenses. He proposed a theory no archaeologist wanted to entertain, that the pyramid wasn't just a symbolic structure, but a machine, a power plant, not powered by electricity as we know it, but by resonance, using the natural vibrations of the earth itself. The granite used in the king's chamber contains quartz crystals which vibrate under pressure, and the layout of the internal shafts. They're not random. They resemble waveguides, acoustic channels. Dunn suggested that the pyramid once operated like a tuning fork, that it amplified seismic energy and converted it into some unknown form of usable power. To many, it sounded like fantasy. But others noticed that his model echoed ancient myths. Myths that speak of a lost civilization, not just skilled, but technologically capable in ways we can't quite define. If this were true, where did such knowledge come from? The ancient Egyptians themselves spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time, a forgotten age when gods walked with men and brought light to the earth. These gods were not deities in the divine sense, but civilizers, bearers of law, architecture, mathematics, agriculture, astronomy. They were always described as tall, radiant, sometimes bearded, oddly distinct from the features of the Egyptians who later honored them. Were they symbolic? Or were they remnants of a memory too distant to decode? Across the world, we find similar whispers. In the Vedas of India, a golden age long before history. In Sumerian tablets, the Anunnaki, beings who came from the heavens and shaped the world. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who brought knowledge before disappearing across the sea. Different names, different continents, but the pattern repeats, an advanced presence before the rise of known civilization. Could they be the same? In 1994, in Turkey, something unimaginable was unearthed. Göbekli Tepe, a megalithic site predating Stonehenge by 6,000 years. Giant T-shaped pillars, each weighing several tons, carved with symbols and animals in bas relief. And beneath the dirt, a design, circles arranged with astronomical precision. The carbon dating shattered all timelines, 11,600 years ago. That was before the end of the last ice age, before cities, before writing, before the wheel. No one can explain how hunter-gatherers, people without metal, without agriculture, built this, or why, after building it, they carefully buried it under layers of sediment, as if to preserve it, or to hide it. Why would a civilization capable of such architecture disappear entirely? And more importantly, why does no one ask that question? Mainstream archaeology cautiously labeled Göbekli Tepe as an anomaly, an outlier. But when outliers accumulate, At what point do we admit our model is wrong? There's another thread, barely visible, running through these stories. Magnetism. The Great Pyramid, when studied using magnetometers, shows localized anomalies. The King's Chamber exhibits a slight but measurable magnetic field, even though there's no metal wiring, no iron. Other megalithic structures, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, Puma Punku, also sit atop zones of high geomagnetic activity. Are these placements coincidental or intentional? Could ancient builders have understood how to harness or align with Earth's energetic grid? Even the myth of Atlantis, once dismissed as mere fantasy, begins to reappear under a new light. Plato wrote of it not as fiction, but as history passed down through Solon from Egyptian priests. He described a technologically advanced society that fell into moral decay and was swallowed by the sea around 9,000 years before his time. That would place it at the end of the Ice Age, at the same time as Göbekli Tepe, the Sphinx's water erosion, and rising sea levels around the globe. And then there is the issue of the missing link in civilization itself. There's a 6,000-year gap between Göbekli Tepe and the first signs of Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. A black hole in time. No gradual development. No slow evolution of tools, language, infrastructure, just silence. Then suddenly, cities, writing, organized religion, astronomy. As if knowledge returned, or was reintroduced. What happened in that gap? Was it a catastrophe, a flood, a reset? Many cultures speak of one. From the Epic of Gilgamesh to the Bible, from the Popol Vuh to Greek legends, a great flood wiped clean the surface of the earth. The gods warned a chosen few. The knowledge was hidden. The temples fell. Is that why the pyramids still stand? Were they built not just to mark time, but to survive it? To endure a deluge? To protect what came before? These aren't answers, only questions. But questions, when asked quietly enough, begin to echo. And in those echoes, we start to feel the presence of something long buried, not just under stone, but under thought. Who were the architects? Why did they vanish? And more than anything, who decided their story should be forgotten? There are shadows in time we're not meant to see, not because they are hidden in darkness, but because we've been told not to look. If the rise of civilization is a staircase, then one step is missing, and we're expected not to notice. It's strange, isn't it? That in all the ruins scattered across the earth, none show a gradual evolution towards the techniques used at Giza. There is no practice run, no prototypes, no failed pyramids carved crudely before mastery was achieved. The Great Pyramid, the most massive, most geometrically perfect, appears at the beginning, not the end, of Egypt's Old Kingdom. Like a symphony whose first note is its most complex. Is that how human learning works? We stumble, refine, progress. But the pyramid story reads differently, as if knowledge wasn't learned, but inherited. It wasn't just the size of the stones. It was how they were placed. In 1991, French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin suggested a new theory, that the pyramid may have been constructed using an internal spiral ramp, not visible from the outside, but embedded within. If true, it would explain how massive blocks were raised without leaving behind external ramps. But there's a problem. No trace of such a ramp has been found. Not a single tunnel, marking or fracture in the stone suggests its existence. So we're left with a choice. believe in a theoretical ramp that vanished without a trace, or question whether conventional methods ever applied at all. And if not, what did? In South America, at the site of Puma Punku in Bolivia, we find megaliths just as mysterious, blocks of diorite stone, one of the hardest materials on Earth, carved with machine-like precision. Right angles, interlocking shapes, drill holes, not etched slowly with stone tools, but shaped as if by instruments that did not exist for thousands of years afterward. The site has no known writing system, no cultural record to explain how it was built, no ruins leading up to it, just appearance and decay. At Baalbek in Lebanon, 3 stones each weighing over 800 tons sit atop a megalithic platform. The trilithon moved uphill, aligned perfectly. Even modern cranes would struggle to lift them. And beneath them, older, rougher blocks, as if an earlier structure was repurposed by later civilizations who could not replicate its methods. Layered history, inverted timelines. We keep calling these sites ancient. But what if they're older than ancient? So old that even the first civilizations found them already crumbling. In 1976, author and researcher Zecharia Sitchin proposed an unorthodox idea. He suggested that Sumerian texts described advanced knowledge of astronomy that shouldn't have existed. The clay tablets referenced distant planets, Uranus and Neptune, thousands of years before their modern discovery. Some even spoke of a 12th celestial body, unknown to our current system, moving in a long elliptical orbit. Scholars dismissed it as misinterpretation. But the question remains, how did they describe Neptune as blue-green and Uranus as watery without telescopes? Were these symbols, guesses, or memory? In Egypt, a similar anomaly emerges. The Dendera temple contains inscriptions that have become known as the Dendera lights, carvings that resemble large bulbs with serpentine filaments inside, connected to what appear to be power sources. Egyptologists call them symbolic representations of creation myths. But electrical engineers have suggested they closely resemble cathode ray tubes. Again, the debate splits sharply. One side clings to metaphor, the other sees mechanism. Could both be true? Could mythology itself be a coded memory, transmitted in images, rituals, stories, not as fiction, but as preservation? Because when disaster strikes, stories survive. And this leads to perhaps the most fragile piece of the puzzle, the gap in human memory. Between 10,800 BCE and 9,600 BCE, Earth went through a sudden and dramatic climate shift known as the Younger Dryas. Temperatures plummeted, ice sheets melted, sea levels rose over 400 feet. Something caused it, a comet perhaps, or multiple impacts. The evidence lies in black mats of charcoal, nanodiamonds, and platinum anomalies scattered across North America and parts of Europe. The Clovis culture vanished. Megafauna went extinct. Entire coastlines were swallowed. And then, silence. What was lost when the waters rose? According to author Graham Hancock, this was the moment the story was reset. That a global cataclysm erased a pre-Ice Age civilization, and that the survivors, what few remained, moved to higher ground, carrying fragments of knowledge, stone cutting, astronomy, sacred geometry. They built temples to withstand time, not to celebrate their power, but to remember their loss. Perhaps the Great Pyramid is not a monument of ego, but a beacon of warning. Its base is a square. Its faces converge upward. It is a pyramid, but also a triangle drawn in 3 dimensions, pointing skyward. It is as if the builders wanted us to look up and down and inward. They encoded not just numbers but meaning. Pi, phi, the golden ratio, the speed of light hidden in its measurements in meters, not accidentally, but purposefully. These are not things one discovers by stacking stones. They require an understanding of physics, of constants, of time itself. If the pyramid was a message, then it wasn't written in words, but in geometry. And maybe that's the only language that survives all ages. But here's what lingers most unsettlingly. Why does this matter so little in modern education? Why are children not told about Göbekli Tepe in school? Why is the precision of the pyramid reduced to footnotes? Why do textbooks still insist the Egyptians used wooden sleds and copper chisels, when those very tools could not have cut the granite chambers? What is protected by this selective blindness? We don't have to answer, we only have to notice the silence. And in that silence, the shape of something unsaid begins to form. A forgotten knowledge, a vanished voice, a history edited not with malice, but with intent. The kind of intent that leaves no fingerprints, only omission. A missing chapter in a book doesn't always leave torn edges. Sometimes the pages are sewn shut so seamlessly, you never realize they were missing at all. So much of history lies not in what's preserved, but in what's been erased. And in that erasure, something ancient still pulses, like a heartbeat under stone. We are taught to believe in a linear path of progress, that everything we know now is the pinnacle of human discovery. That civilization grew slowly, predictably, one stone atop another. But what if the opposite is true? What if we are not the summit, but the aftermath? In the sands of Saqqara, not far from the Giza Plateau, lies something almost always overlooked, a deep, narrow shaft descending into darkness. At its base, the Serapeum, a chamber carved into the bedrock, containing more than 20 granite boxes, each weighing over 70 tons. Each lid alone weighs 30 tons. Their surfaces are mirror-polished. Their corners are so perfect, only modern laser tools could replicate them. The boxes were made from a single piece of granite or basalt, materials nearly impossible to work with copper or stone tools. Egyptologists say these were sarcophagi for sacred bulls. But there's a problem. The boxes are far too large for the animals they supposedly held, and most were found empty, not just devoid of remains, but untouched. No soot, no offerings, no signs of ritual. Why build something so precise, to leave it sealed and silent? When Christopher Dunn inspected these boxes, he found their interiors deviated less than 0.002 of an inch. That kind of precision in solid granite suggests not symbolism, but engineering. Precision not for ceremony, but for function, for containment, or resonance. Were they meant to store something no longer present? And why bury them beneath the earth in a location almost impossible to access? Again, we are offered the same explanations. Religious meaning, symbolic power. But symbolism does not require tolerances finer than a human hair. Symbolism doesn't demand 70-ton lids that fit like vacuum seals. What then was the Serapeum? And who had the tools to make it? The more you look, the more anomalies rise like specters from the dust. In Egypt's Temple of Hathor at Dendera, high above the columns, inscriptions show something even stranger. figures holding what appear to be arc-shaped tubes attached to objects resembling generators or coils. Snakes spiral through the tubes, and lotus flowers emerge from what looks like bulb sockets. Are they religious symbols or technical diagrams? The images are too precise to ignore, too unique to explain away. Nearby, in Abydos, another carving quietly sparks debate. Hidden beneath centuries of sediment, high on a temple beam, is the so-called helicopter glyph. It appears to show futuristic images, a helicopter, a submarine, and even what resembles a flying saucer. Egyptologists explain this as palimpsest, overlapping hieroglyphs eroded over time. But others argue the lines are too defined, the resemblance too sharp, to dismiss so easily. If the ancients had no knowledge of flight, why do echoes of it appear in stone? And more importantly, why is the conversation around these anomalies so carefully avoided? One could argue that archaeologists are simply cautious, that they rely on hard evidence. But caution often becomes gatekeeping. When new questions are asked, old systems close ranks. Funding dries up. Careers are threatened. Excavations are paused. And entire possibilities are filed under pseudoscience before they are even tested. In 2017, when the Scan Pyramids project used muon tomography to discover a massive void within the Great Pyramid, the announcement made headlines. A space the size of an airliner, completely sealed, previously unknown. And then, nothing. Years have passed. No probes sent, no cameras lowered, no plans announced to explore it further. Why? If we discovered a sealed chamber in Notre Dame or beneath the Louvre, would we not investigate? Would curiosity not demand it? But in Giza, silence is louder than action. Even when we are told something is impossible, the stone tells its own story. At the base of the Great Pyramid, the casing stones once shone like mirrors. Made of white Tura limestone, they were cut so precisely that a razor blade couldn't fit between them. They've since been looted or eroded, but the few that remain show workmanship beyond our current large-scale building capabilities. These stones were not just decorative. They refracted sunlight, turning the pyramid into a beacon, visible for miles. Some ancient sources, like Pliny the Elder, even described it as blinding in the midday sun. Was it simply grandeur, or a form of energy, a signal? Because light, sound, and vibration were sacred to ancient cultures, seen not just as forces, but as languages. Languages that could encode intention, memory, even transformation. Is it possible that what we call temples were not just places of worship, but of technology? In the Temple of Karnak, over 100 columns rise like frozen trees, aligned with the sun's solstice paths. When sound echoes through them, it creates harmonic frequencies that resonate in the human chest. It isn't poetic, it's measurable. And it's been replicated by acoustical engineers. The same resonance exists in the king's chamber, where certain chants and tones amplify unnaturally. Coincidence? Or was ancient architecture designed to interact with the human body, physically, energetically? This idea was once heretical. Now it is measurable. The problem is not that these things are unknown, it's that they are inconvenient. They do not fit the tidy narrative. They demand a different view of the past, one that suggests not a linear climb from ignorance to knowledge, but a spiral, where understanding rises, falls, and rises again. What if the ancients knew things we've only just begun to rediscover? And if so, who taught them? Who walked among the sands before the pharaohs and spoke in the language of vibration and stone? Who measured Earth's curvature and aligned stone to starlight before cities were born? Are we the descendants of their forgetting, or the witnesses of their erasure? The stones do not speak, but they remember. And if you listen long enough, the silence becomes a question. What else did they leave behind that we no longer know how to see? Some truths are not buried under sand or stone. They're buried under language, under words that soften, words that blur, words like myth, coincidence, symbolic. But myths are not lies. They are memories, wrapped in poetry, disguised in metaphor, because that is the only way some knowledge survives the fire. And fire, it seems, has visited our past more often than we admit. The Library of Alexandria, once the heart of the ancient world, thousands of scrolls, maps, charts, languages, gone, burned, lost, not in one night, but across centuries of conquest and silence. Some say Julius Caesar's siege ignited the first flame. Others blame Theophilus, or the Muslim conquest, or simple negligence. But what matters is not who lit the match. What matters is what we lost. The knowledge of forgotten continents. Star charts with orbits we only rediscovered with telescopes. Healing practices using vibration and sound. Calculations of distance and time that shouldn't have existed before the mechanical clock. Who wrote those scrolls? And why does their disappearance feel orchestrated? When knowledge is inconvenient, history rewrites itself. Take the Antikythera mechanism. Found in a shipwreck off the coast of Greece in 1901, it was dismissed at first as a gear-encrusted curiosity. Only decades later did we realize what it was: an analog computer. Bronze gears, dozens of them, calibrated to predict eclipses, planetary motion, and lunar phases with remarkable accuracy. It dates to 150 BCE. Nothing else like it exists from the ancient world. It should not be there. And yet, there it is. An orphan of time, a scream across the centuries, muffled by the ocean and by disbelief. How could such technology exist in an era when people were supposedly using sundials and astrolabes? Where did this device come from? Who built it? And where did the knowledge go afterward? The answer, again, is silence. A silence too sharp to be natural. In the Valley of the Kings, another silence lingers. The tomb of Seti contains a ceiling fresco, known as the astronomical ceiling. It maps constellations with stunning accuracy, including circumpolar stars. The Egyptians even had a word for the precession of the equinoxes. Zep Tepi, the first time. A lost era, hinted at in sacred texts as a golden age before the flood. They didn't believe history began with them, but that they were merely the last keepers of its flame. We don't teach that. We reduce their knowledge to folklore. We edit the past so it looks like a mirror of the present. Slow, clumsy, incomplete. But real mirrors don't flatter. They reveal. And when we hold the past up to the light, the cracks show. Across the globe, structures bear impossible symmetry, impossible size, impossible alignment. In Cambodia, Angkor Wat aligns with the constellation Draco. In Mexico, Teotihuacan mirrors the Orion Belt. In the Andes, the ancient city of Tiwanaku points directly to the cardinal directions, and may once have included a solar calendar accurate to within seconds. Separate cultures, separate timelines, the same sky, the same patterns. Somehow they knew, and not just in spirit, but in stone. So we must ask, is this convergence an accident, or the faint fingerprint of a forgotten map? And if there was a map, if there was a pattern, why has it been scattered so deliberately? Consider this. Most major megalithic sites are built on what researchers call ley lines, invisible energy paths that crisscross the earth. Ancient builders seemed to know where these lines intersected. Giza, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, Chaco Canyon. All constructed along these pathways with strange precision, often correlating with electromagnetic anomalies, or strange behavior in compasses and radio waves. What were they tuning into? Was it the Earth itself, or something above? In the Dogon tribe of Mali, oral traditions passed through centuries tell of a star named Sirius B, too faint to be seen without a telescope. They describe its orbit, its density, its invisible presence, all confirmed only in the 20th century. Anthropologists were baffled. Had they guessed or remembered? The Dogon say they were taught by beings from Sirius, not gods, not metaphors. Beings. The priests called them the Nomo. It sounds absurd until you study the detail, until you realize they knew something they should not have. And the question repeats itself like a mantra. Where does knowledge come from? Who decides what survives? Every excavation is an argument with time, but some discoveries are arguments with authority. In 1944, a Hungarian engineer named Laszlo Nemeth examined the acoustic properties of the Great Pyramid. He found that certain frequencies amplified unnaturally inside the king's chamber. Later tests confirmed it. Sound lingers, resonates, amplifies, almost as if the chamber was designed not for burial, but for vibration. Could the pyramid have been a sonic device? A resonator of the Earth's frequency? And if so, for what purpose? We think of technology in terms of wires and screens. But what if the ancients saw it differently? Not as control over nature, but harmony with it? Maybe the pyramid wasn't a machine in the mechanical sense, but in the energetic. A node, a beacon, a memory. And maybe that's why it still stands. Because unlike wood or copper or even iron, meaning lasts when carved into frequency, into ratio, into stone that holds both weight and silence. There's a reason the Great Pyramid contains no hieroglyphs, no boasts, no names, no gods, just geometry, just orientation, just intention. It is not a monument to ego, but to eternity. And that may be the clearest clue of all, because the things built to endure usually contain something worth remembering. So then, why is it so carefully ignored? Why does mainstream history not teach us about muon chambers, acoustic anomalies, or global alignments? Why are the implications of Göbekli Tepe and the Antikythera mechanism softened in textbooks, like blunted blades? Is it because we're afraid? Afraid that if we admit we are not the first advanced civilization, we might have to ask what happened to the last one? And more than that, whether the same fate waits for us. The answers may still be buried, but the questions, once asked, cannot be unasked. And in the quiet between those questions, something ancient stirs. History, we are told, is a record, but more often, it is a rehearsal, a script rewritten by those still standing, while the voices of the fallen fade into dust. For every monument that survives, there are countless more that have been erased, not by erosion, but by human hands, removed from sight, from speech, from memory. And in that silence, we are left with stories that feel incomplete. Glimpses, not answers. Consider the Sumerians, the first known writers. They spoke of gods descending from the sky, of flying chariots and fire-breathing wheels, of star maps and cycles so long they defy human lifespan. Modern historians call these myths poetic exaggerations from primitive minds. But the Sumerians were anything but primitive. They tracked Venus with mathematical precision. They divided time into 60 seconds, 60 minutes. Their calendar aligned with lunar solar patterns more accurate than some modern versions. They wrote of Nibiru, a celestial object that enters Earth's neighborhood in intervals of thousands of years, a wandering body, perhaps, or a metaphor. That's the question scholars avoid, because the alternative suggests they knew far more than they should have. And perhaps they weren't alone in knowing. In Mohenjo-Daro, once part of the Indus Valley civilization, archaeologists found skeletons lying in streets, arms outstretched, faces frozen in terror. There were no signs of warfare, no weapons, no mass burial, just sudden, unexplained death. Some theories, far from mainstream acceptance, have dared to suggest the area shows signs of extreme heat. Buildings fused at their foundation, stone turned to glass. Natural disaster? Possibly, but vitrification, turning stone to glass, requires temperatures over 1500 Basarikasert, the kind of temperatures produced in modern-day nuclear blasts. It's a disturbing thought, too disturbing perhaps, and so it is not taught, it is not even explored. But omission is never neutral. When archaeologist J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, was asked if the Trinity test in 1945 was the first nuclear explosion, he paused. Then softly said, "Yes, in modern times." What did he mean? In the ancient Sanskrit epic, the Mahabharata, there are passages that describe weapons so destructive they made the sun shine 10,000 times brighter. That turned hair white, eyes blind, and flesh to ash. Chariots flew without wings. Cities burned from the inside out. Rivers boiled. Wind howled with toxic breath. Was it just allegory? Or was it a fragmented record of something too dangerous to remember clearly? Because remembering has always carried risk. When Nikola Tesla died in 1943, the U.S. government seized his papers under something called the Alien Property Custodian. Though Tesla was a citizen, his ideas were considered sensitive. Among those papers were diagrams for a device he claimed could produce limitless energy by harnessing the resonance of the Earth. He spoke of vibration, frequency, geometry, the same elements found in pyramid design, temple acoustics, and ancient cosmology. His theories were dismissed as eccentricity. But why confiscate eccentricity? Unless someone understood what he was rediscovering. Tesla once said, "If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration." 3 words that echo back through the pyramids, through megaliths, through the whisper of glyphs carved in silence. If knowledge can threaten power, then ignorance becomes protection. This is how timelines are maintained, how questions are made impolite, how possibility is shaped into ridicule. When you look too closely at the cracks in the story, people shift uncomfortably. They tell you to trust the experts. But experts, too, are shaped by funding, by tenure, by peer review panels that reward agreement, not inquiry. And so the silence thickens. The stones remain unstudied. The chambers remain unopened. The stars go uncharted. Again. But the earth still remembers. There are places where the land itself feels aware. In the highlands of Peru, near the ruins of Sacsayhuaman, enormous walls rise, stones so tightly fitted you cannot slide a blade between them. Some stones weigh over 100 tons. They interlock with such complexity that modern engineers admit they could not recreate the wall today with all our cranes and software. The stones are not regular rectangles, but odd, multi-sided shapes, some with as many as 12 or 13 angles locking into one another like puzzle pieces. Why build this way? It was not faster, not easier, not cheaper, but it was durable, earthquake-resistant. Centuries of tremors could not move those walls, while colonial buildings around them crumbled. Was it just craftsmanship, or a language? The ancients did not write in letters alone. They encoded thought in shape, weight, sound, direction, and when the Spanish arrived, they asked the Inca how such structures were made. The answer: they were already here. Time and again, across continents, cultures echo the same refrain. We did not build this. We inherited it. But who were the builders? And why do they not appear in our textbooks? We have no name for them, only echoes. Some call them the antediluvians, those who lived before the flood. Others speak of the watchers, the architects, the shining ones. They are remembered in symbols: the eye above the pyramid, the staff entwined by serpents, the compass and the square. Symbols found not just in temples, but embedded in institutions that persist to this day. Are they remnants or reminders? Even today, satellite imagery reveals ruins beneath dense jungle canopies, entire cities in the Amazon, in Cambodia, in Africa. Patterns too regular to be natural. But exploration is slow. Permission is harder to get. And stories, once uncovered, are quickly categorized and forgotten. Because to rewrite history, we must first unlearn it. And unlearning is painful. It demands humility. It demands we accept that we may not be the peak of civilization, but its echo. So we stand on the ruins of the old world, convinced we are the first to rise. But deep beneath our feet, something still waits. Something that once was known, and perhaps is waiting to be remembered. When maps lie, it's not the ink that deceives us. It's the silence between the lines. And on one ancient map, silence stretches wider than the oceans. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis compiled a naval chart that has haunted scholars for over a century. It showed the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and something else. A landmass where none should have been. A detailed, proportionally correct depiction of Antarctica, beneath its ice. But Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, and even then, its subglacial topography wasn't known until the 20th century, mapped through seismic data. How, then, did a sailor in the 16th century draw it with such accuracy? Piri Reis claimed his map was not original. He had copied it from older sources, charts from the Library of Alexandria, fragments passed from hand to hand, through empires now reduced to sand. And in the margins of the map, he left notes, uncertain, reverent. He called it ancient. This map should not exist. And yet, it does. It is not the only one. The Orontius Phineus map of 1531, the Boache map of 1737, each showing parts of Antarctica as a mountainous continent, not a frozen desert. each allegedly based on even earlier sources. Cartographers made them without the benefit of satellite imaging, radar, or modern coordinates. What they had, somehow, was knowledge from a different age. What kind of civilization knew the shape of the continents before they were buried in ice? Was it a seafaring people, a global culture, or something older, something that saw Earth not as pieces, but as a whole? Across thousands of miles and centuries of forgetting, echoes of such a culture remain. In Easter Island, over 800 Moai statues stare inland with empty eyes. Carved from volcanic rock, some weigh more than 80 tons. Beneath the surface, most extend into full torsos, sunk over time into the earth. How they were transported and raised remains a mystery. Oral tradition speaks of the manna, a force that allowed stone to walk. Across the ocean in Western Europe, the megaliths of Karnak stretch for miles, rows of stone standing like silent sentinels. No one knows who built them, no records, no clear function, just alignment, direction, order, as if someone were measuring something not written in words. In Australia, near the coast of New South Wales, lies the Wurdi Yuang stone arrangement. It is a low ring of boulders, seemingly unremarkable, but the positioning matches the solar solstices and equinoxes with uncanny precision. Aboriginal elders say it predates their living memory. Some researchers estimate it may be over 10,000 years old. Different continents, different tongues, the same knowledge. And more than that, the same loss. It's not just that we don't understand what these structures were for, it's that we barely ask. Because asking would mean rewriting too much. It would mean that civilization is not a straight line, but a circle, that we are not the product of unbroken progress, but survivors of an age we no longer remember. That knowledge once spanned the globe and fell, and with it something broke. A kind of coherence, a unity. We speak different languages now, but once, perhaps, we spoke one. Philologist Alfredo Trombetti, in the early 20th century, argued that all human languages could be traced back to a single root. So did Joseph Greenberg. Today, this idea is met with skepticism, not because it's disproven, but because it's too difficult. The deeper you go, the blurrier the data becomes. Sounds shift, scripts vanish, cultures burn, the trail fades. But the question lingers. What if there was a mother tongue? What if the builders of the pyramids, the stone masons of Sacsayhuaman, the astronomers of Angkor, and the sailors of Piri Reis's map all shared fragments of the same forgotten inheritance? A memory broken across continents, a knowledge shattered like glass, but still catching light. Even in myth, the pattern repeats. The Hopi speak of previous worlds, civilizations that rose and fell. The third world, they say, was destroyed by water. The fourth is the one we live in now. In Hindu cosmology, the yugas mark cycles of time, descending ages from golden to dark. We are said to be in Kali Yuga, the age of forgetting, the furthest point from wisdom. In each version, memory decays, not because time erases it, but because we stop listening. Ancient sites whisper to us, not in sentences, but in resonance, in geometry, in placements that match stars, solstices, planetary alignments. Stonehenge aligns with the midsummer sunrise. So does Newgrange in Ireland. So does the Temple of Karnak. The same celestial choreography, from builders who never met, unless they did. And the sky itself changes. Due to axial precession, the stars above shift over thousands of years. Orion rises and falls. Polaris was not always the North Star. In 10,500 BCE, the stars of Orion's belt aligned directly over the pyramids at Giza. That same date appears in the layout of Angkor Wat. That same date reappears in the oldest flood myths. Coincidence, or a date worth remembering? A time before the flood, a time before forgetting. But memory has its guardians. Throughout history, secret societies and esoteric orders have preserved symbols that predate their official founding. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, the Hermeticists, all use the compass and square, the all-seeing eye, the pyramid. Why? Where did these symbols come from? Why are they carved into temples, etched into currency, woven into global architecture? Perhaps they are not just emblems of secrecy, but of survival, of an idea too old to explain, that long ago Earth was known, mapped, understood, not just its geography, but its energy, its song, its pulse, and that someone tried to preserve that song, in stone, in myth, in silence. But silence is never permanent. It waits, patiently, for questions bold enough to pierce it. And as we ask, softly, insistently, the shape of a truth too old to name begins to emerge. What if our ancestors weren't inventing civilization, but remembering it? Some monuments are not meant for the living. They are messages, meant to be read after death. The ancient Egyptians, we are told, were obsessed with the afterlife. Tombs lined with spells, sarcophagi sealed with gold, hearts weighed against feathers. But there's something odd about how little we find in the most important places. Inside the Great Pyramid, no inscriptions, no elaborate murals, no record of passage to the next world, just stone. Cold, geometric, silent. If it were truly a tomb, it is unlike any other. Not even the pharaoh's name appears within. Khufu, we're told, built it. But the only mention of his name was found decades after excavation, in a red ochre cartouche scribbled inside a hidden shaft. A marking so contested that some believe it was added in modern times by the crew of Colonel Weiss, eager to confirm their theories and secure a claim. The core structure itself does not point to death. It points to alignment, to energy, to motion. The king's chamber, with its polished granite box, never sealed, never adorned, feels less like a coffin and more like a device. A chamber tuned, perhaps, not to preserve a body, but to transform a soul. Ancient texts speak of the House of the Horizon, a place where the soul of the king would ascend to the stars, specifically to Orion's belt, associated with the god Osiris, ruler of the afterlife and symbol of resurrection. The southern shaft of the Great Pyramid aligns precisely with the belt stars around 2500 BCE. The northern shaft aligns with Thuban, the pole star of that era. These aren't just symbolic gestures. They are architectural commitments, fixed in stone, measured to the heavens. So what were the builders trying to channel? What doorway were they opening? In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the journey after death is not chaotic. It is geometric. The soul moves through gates, halls, angles of judgment. Sound, light, vibration, all serve as keys. There's mention of the field of reeds, a mirror of earth, reached not by wandering, but by precision. Could it be that the Great Pyramid was a kind of engine for consciousness? Not for the dead body, but for the awareness that remained? We still don't fully understand the relationship between geometry and perception, But studies in cymatics, the science of visible sound, show that when frequencies are applied to substances like sand or water, they form distinct patterns. The higher the frequency, the more complex the geometry. What happens when those same frequencies are applied to the human brain? In ancient temples, chants weren't just songs. They were tools, mantras, tones, ritual syllables, each aimed not at gods, but at transformation. The Om, the Aum, the Yao, sound-shaping awareness. And in the heart of the pyramid, a resonant box, quartz-rich granite, amplifies sound in strange ways. Tones linger, harmonics emerge. Some who've entered report vibrations in their chest, even disorientation. Not fear, not dread, but shift, as if something inside them moved sideways. Modern studies in neuroacoustics have shown that certain frequencies, binaural beats, can change brainwave patterns. Alpha, theta, delta, deep relaxation, meditative trance, lucid states, borderlands between waking and dream. What if the ancients knew this? Not as theory, but as experience. Not superstition, but science, encoded in stone. That would make the pyramid not just a structure, but a passage. A gate not made of wood or gold, but of ratio, echo, and mass. A place where soul and sound might merge or separate. And this perhaps is why we are told it was a tomb. Because if we saw it for what it truly was, we might start asking what else we've misunderstood. The ancients viewed death differently. In the Tibetan Bardo Thodol, the so-called Tibetan Book of the Dead, death is not an end, but a transition. A 49-day journey through inner landscapes filled with light, memory, and confrontation. The soul, unmoored from the body, must recognize illusion or be drawn back to the cycle of rebirth. Egypt, too, saw death as a test of recognition. The heart weighed, the soul questioned. The voice declared innocent or unworthy, but the emphasis always was on passage, on movement. And in that movement, perhaps, geometry played a role. The pyramid's slope, about 51.84 degrees, has long puzzled engineers, but it is not random. It encodes the golden ratio. The relationship between the base, the height, and the slant reveals P and F within a fraction of perfection. This is not decoration. This is signal. The golden ratio appears in nature. Shells, hurricanes, spiral galaxies. It's the ratio of growth, of harmony. To encode that in a structure of this scale is to declare intent. To say, this too is alive. And perhaps that's the truth we've ignored, that the pyramid was not built for the dead, but for what remains. Consciousness, a word we still don't fully understand. Not thought, not awareness, something deeper. The thread that remembers us when our names are forgotten. In recent decades, physics has begun to brush against ideas once dismissed as mysticism, quantum entanglement, observer effect, non-locality. The idea that the act of seeing may shape the thing seen. That consciousness may not arise from the brain, but filter through it. What if the ancients already knew? What if they weren't trying to preserve kings, but consciousness itself? Imagine a civilization that reached not outward, but inward. That mapped not oceans, but awareness. That understood death not as decay, but as shift, and built monuments not to defy mortality, but to navigate it. Would such a civilization leave behind journals, timelines, museums, or would they leave behind stone? Echo, light trapped in angle. And we, standing on the ruins, convinced they worshipped death, when in fact they may have mastered something far more eternal. The silence in the king's chamber is not empty. It is waiting. For breath, for sound, for someone who remembers what it was for. A monument does not have to speak to say something. It only has to endure. When the words are gone and the builders long forgotten, it is the structure itself that becomes the message. A code, a presence, a question carved in stone. And some questions don't fade, they echo. Across the world, monuments rise with no inscription, no history, no clear builder. They don't tell us what they are, but they tell us where they are. And that might be everything. The Great Pyramid stands at the 30th parallel north. Stonehenge lies just north of the 51st. Angkor Wat, near the 13th. Chichen Itza, the 20th. When viewed together, a strange grid emerges. A pattern. A map not of culture, but of energy, light, and celestial rhythm. The Earth isn't static. It hums. Its magnetic field pulses. Its surface vibrates. Ancient traditions once called these points dragon lines in China, song lines in Australia, ley lines in Europe. Invisible pathways that carry something, an essence, a breath beneath the land. Modern science scoffs at the idea. There are no measurable energy flows across these lines, they say. But then again, gravity cannot be seen either, and magnetism cannot be touched. And yet, they shape everything. Could it be that these ancient sites were not chosen for their beauty or their proximity to water, but for their resonance, their harmony with something we no longer measure? In 1973, Russian scientists Goncharov, Makarov, and Morozov proposed the Earth grid theory, an icosahedron-based geometric framework mapped onto the globe. They discovered that major ancient sites, including the pyramids of Egypt and Mexico, the Nazca Lines, Easter Island, Mohenjo-Daro, and the Bermuda Triangle, all fell along this theoretical pattern. Coincidence or design? We often forget that ancient builders were also sky watchers. Every solstice, equinox, eclipse, they observed, recorded, responded. But what's harder to explain is how disconnected civilizations, without known contact, followed the same stars, built along the same latitudes, oriented structures to the same rising and setting points. The Temple of Luxor in Egypt and the ancient city of Teotihuacan in Mexico both mirror the human body, mapped anatomically. The former along a spinal axis, the latter with pyramids placed as energy centers. How? Why? Was this architecture or memory? The Maya believed that their pyramids connected to the cosmos. The temple of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza casts a serpent-shaped shadow down its staircase each equinox, a precise celestial event choreographed in stone. The temple is also aligned to the solar zenith passage, the point when the sun sits directly overhead, casting no shadow. A moment of suspension, of stillness. Did they believe the gods lived in that stillness? In Cambodia, Angkor Wat mirrors the constellation Draco, an ancient serpent in the sky. In Egypt, the three pyramids mirror Orion's belt. At Teotihuacan, the same triadic pattern repeats. These are not random correspondences. They appear again and again, across culture, ocean, language. Did these civilizations see the sky not just as inspiration, but as instruction? It raises a strange possibility. one most academics refuse to consider. What if the monuments were meant to talk to one another? Not in sound, but in placement, orientation, frequency, not across time, but through it. A planetary system of memory, disguised as myth, mistaken as temple. Modern physicists speak of information not as concept, but as reality. In quantum theory, information cannot be destroyed, only transformed. Every action, every event leaves an imprint. And if the ancients knew this, if they believed the earth itself could remember, then perhaps they built not to celebrate power, but to preserve knowledge. Stone outlives fire, alignment outlives empire, and the sky remains the same canvas. If you align Giza's 3 pyramids and project the line outward, it intersects with Baalbek in Lebanon, Ur in Iraq, and Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan. Stretch the pattern across oceans, and it begins to trace a subtle web, one only visible from above. But these weren't gods. They were surveyors, astronomers, builders with tools we no longer understand. In the Incan city of Ollantaytambo, massive stones, carved to interlock with neighboring blocks, fit together with no mortar, no error. Not even earthquake has disturbed them. Their corners are beveled, their surfaces worn by something not weather, not time, but perhaps sound. Acoustic levitation is no longer science fiction. In laboratory conditions, objects have been lifted with ultrasonic vibrations. Small objects, yes, but the principle remains. Sound can shape, move, sustain. Was it once scaled up? The temple walls at Abydos have odd scorch marks. The stones at Puma Punku appear sliced. Were these places construction sites or demonstrations? We can only guess. But we do know this. They did not build randomly. Pyramids were not exclusive to Egypt. We find them in Sudan, in China, buried under forest, in Bosnia, where satellite imaging has revealed symmetrical structures taller than Giza, in Central America, Southeast Asia, even parts of Europe. Not just similar in shape, but in proportion, in orientation, in mystery. The pyramid is not a symbol of death. It is a symbol of direction. A shape that points upward, inward, onward. And perhaps that's why it was chosen again and again. Not because it was sacred, but because it worked. The deeper question is, worked for what? Transmission? Reception? Transformation? We assume pyramids are passive. But what if they are active, still humming at frequencies too subtle for modern instruments, still vibrating with purpose long after the builders vanished? And what if they're not alone? What if the earth is dotted with such beacons, quiet, sleeping, waiting to be heard? The ancient world may not have been divided as we think, not isolated kingdoms and tribal languages, but facets of a greater knowledge, a wisdom shattered, then scattered, not by arrogance, but by catastrophe. And now, we are the ones walking among their ruins, searching for a past too large to see whole. But maybe the monuments were never meant to tell us everything. Maybe they were left so we would remember to ask. Not everything is lost slowly. Some things disappear all at once. A breath, a flash, a wave, and suddenly, silence. What if the civilizations that came before us didn't simply fade? They were interrupted. Not by decline, but by disaster. Sudden, violent, erasing. The signs are everywhere, beneath oceans, inside glaciers, buried in layers of ash and mud. But we're told not to look too closely, because when we do, the timelines begin to shift. In 2012, a team of scientists led by James Kennett published research on a layer of Earth known as the Younger Dryas boundary. This sediment band, found across North America, contains tiny diamonds, melted glass, and platinum, all indicators of intense heat. Catastrophic heat. They proposed a bold idea that around 12,800 years ago, a massive cosmic impact, possibly a fragmented comet, struck the Earth, setting off a chain reaction. Fires, floods, atmospheric disruption, a sudden return to Ice Age conditions. It matched myths around the world: floods, fire, falling stars. And it left a scar on human history. What came before that event is mostly gone. Cities would have drowned, forests turned to ash, survivors scattered. And survivors forget, not because they want to, but because memory, like light, dims with distance. And after enough generations, even truth begins to sound like story. Atlantis. It's the name we give to this amnesia. But Atlantis is not just a tale of hubris. Plato's account is precise, unflinching. A technologically advanced society destroyed in a single day and night of misfortune, swallowed by the sea. He placed it 9,000 years before his time, around 11,600 BCE. The same moment glaciers melted. The same moment the sea rose. The same moment the earth trembled. Most historians call it fiction, but they rarely address the timing. Because when myth and geology agree, we're forced to rethink what's real. In Doggerland, a stretch of land that once connected Britain to mainland Europe, submerged ruins and tools have been discovered beneath the North Sea. Not scattered debris, but evidence of settlement, agriculture, life. Now it sleeps underwater. In the Caribbean, off the coast of Cuba, sonar scans have revealed symmetrical formations, rectangular blocks, pyramidal shapes, at depths over 2,000 feet. Too deep for recent ruins, too regular to be dismissed. Oceanographers remain cautious, but divers who've glimpsed it speak of corridors, of outlines that shouldn't be there. What kind of flood would bury a city that deep? And how many more are still hidden beneath the waves? In India's Gulf of Khambat, marine archaeologists discovered submerged artifacts, pottery, tools, even human remains, carbon dated to nearly 9,500 years ago. That predates the rise of Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. Yet the discovery received little attention. Why? Because it doesn't fit. It rewrites the idea that civilization began in Mesopotamia, that we slowly climbed from the caves, invented writing, then built cities. But what if cities came first? What if the invention was not civilization, but survival? Those who remained would have remembered the old world as myth. They would have carried pieces, sacred geometry, oral stories, star maps, into new lands. And slowly, a new timeline would begin. But not from zero, from fragments. This is how memory survives cataclysm, in symbol, not sentence. In Göbekli Tepe, a megalithic site in Turkey dated to at least 11,600 years ago, a stone pillar known as Pillar 43 shows a series of carved animals and symbols. For years, they were dismissed as totems. But in 2017, researchers proposed that the carvings actually correspond to constellations, specifically the position of the night sky on the date of the Younger Dryas impact: Scorpio, Sagittarius, the galactic center. A sky frozen in stone. A warning? The site was deliberately buried, preserved beneath tons of earth. Who buries something like that? Who protects a site by sealing it away? Not a collapsing culture, a remembering one. They weren't trying to build a monument. They were trying to send a message. But the language of that message is not modern. It's not written in characters we recognize. It speaks through alignment, pattern, echo, like a voice trapped in a dream, too distant to hear, but close enough to feel. And still, we turn away. Because the moment we accept that civilization is older than we've been told, everything else begins to unravel. Religion, chronology, identity, purpose. We are not at the beginning of history. We are in the middle of something cyclical. In the Mayan calendar, time is not a line. It is a spiral. Ages repeat. Worlds end. Worlds begin again. Not metaphorically, but cosmically. The long count calendar ended in 2012. Many feared disaster. But perhaps the true message wasn't doom, but transition. An invitation to remember, to look back, so we may move forward. Ancient prophecies, ignored by academia, speak of cycles. The Hopi tell of 4 worlds. Hindu cosmology speaks of 4 yugas. In both, we are now in the last and darkest phase, a time of forgetting, of disconnection. But every end holds the seed of return. Perhaps the ancients did not build to celebrate power. Perhaps they built to survive forgetting, to leave behind breadcrumbs of geometry and resonance, so that one day, when the next cycle begins, someone will follow them back. Not to rebuild the same world, but to understand why it fell. And maybe to choose differently. So we return to the pyramids, to the Sphinx, to the monuments that refuse to erode. We look not with eyes of superiority, but with humility. Because if something came before us, something global, intelligent, tuned to the stars, then our own story is not about invention, it is about remembering. And in that remembering, we may rediscover more than history. We may rediscover who we are. Forgetting is not always an accident. Sometimes it's a decision. A quiet agreement between generations to stop asking a question that has no easy answer. What happened before us? Before the textbooks, before the dates, before the names we're allowed to remember? It's strange how confidently we speak about the past, how entire centuries are compressed into neat paragraphs. A few names, a few events, then on to the next chapter. But between those lines is something more fragile, something soft and volatile, like breath against glass. It's not just what we remember that shapes us, it's what we choose to forget. Because forgetting isn't always silence, sometimes it's noise. A flood of theories, distractions, conflicting voices. So much information that clarity becomes impossible. So we retreat into certainty, into stories already agreed upon. And the questions, the real ones, fade beneath the surface. Who controls the stories we call history? Not the past itself. It doesn't speak. We speak for it. In 1837, Egyptologist Carl Richard Lepsius stood among the ruins of ancient Saqqara. He catalogued hundreds of monuments. But when he reached the site now known as the Osirian, beneath the temple of Seti the Firm, he hesitated. The structure was different. Deep underground, megalithic, made of rose granite blocks weighing over 100 tons. The architecture resembled no other structure from that time. There were no inscriptions, no hieroglyphs, no ornamental markers, just stone, massive, silent, and old. Too old? Egyptologists said no. They claimed it was a symbolic construction made to appear ancient, part of Seti's temple complex, but the foundation sits far lower than any surrounding ruins. Its weathering is more advanced, its style more archaic, like a relic from another epoch, mistakenly preserved beneath the layers of empire. The anomaly was noted, then ignored. Why? Because it didn't fit, and in history, what doesn't fit doesn't survive. The same pattern appears elsewhere. In 1996, a young researcher named Semir Osmanagic began studying the hills of Visoko, Bosnia. He noticed unnatural shapes, pyramidal slopes, sharp triangular faces, the formations aligned with cardinal directions. Underground tunnels wound beneath them, stretching for miles. He proposed the unthinkable, that these were not hills, but man-made pyramids, older than any in Egypt. The backlash was immediate, not debate, not cautious critique, rejection. Experts called it pseudoscience, a hoax, a fantasy. But core samples revealed human-made concrete, harder than modern cement. Tunnel walls showed tool marks. Electromagnetic surveys revealed energy beams rising from the apex of the so-called Pyramid of the Sun. Constant, measurable, unexplained. And yet no mainstream institution would investigate further. Because once you cross a certain line, you're no longer a scholar. You're a threat. Not to truth, but to narrative. History, after all, is not just a record of what happened. It's a scaffold for identity, for power, for control. If we rewrite it, we must also rewrite who we think we are. And that kind of shift is not always welcome. Consider the Smithsonian Institution, an organization long held as a pillar of historical preservation. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, newspapers across America reported discoveries of giant human skeletons, over 7 feet tall, unearthed from burial mounds in the Midwest. These stories ran in respected outlets. The artifacts were reportedly sent to the Smithsonian. And then, silence. When pressed, the institution claimed no such remains were ever found, that the reports were exaggerated or false. And maybe they were, but maybe they weren't. In 2014, the American Institution of Alternative Archaeology filed a lawsuit against the Smithsonian, alleging a century-long cover-up. They claimed the institution had destroyed thousands of skeletons that contradicted accepted anthropological models. The case was dismissed. No evidence, no records, no comment. Only questions. What happens when evidence contradicts doctrine? When the past refuses to match the map? It is buried, not under earth, but under policy. Because the most effective way to erase a truth is not to destroy it. It's to discredit those who speak it. Label them fringe, conspiracy, irrational. And then turn up the noise. Flood the conversation with absurdity. Reptilian aliens, hollow earth, time travel, and let real anomalies drown in the mix. That way, when someone dares to question the past, they're not taken seriously. They're grouped with the outrageous, and history stays safe. But safe from what? From truth or from memory? Because deep down, in the folds of forgotten ritual and misplaced stone, something waits. Not to be believed, just to be noticed. An old voice, a lingering pattern. You feel it in the way the pyramids refuse to crumble, in the resonance of a chant no longer understood, in the geometry that repeats across oceans and time as if echoing a forgotten blueprint. And the blueprint may not be physical, it may be psychological. The pyramids, the temples, the megaliths, they may have been built not just to preserve culture, but to preserve consciousness, to store a frequency, a way of thinking, a way of remembering. Because when memory fails, civilization must start over. And if that is the cycle, catastrophe, forgetting, rediscovery, then these monuments become something more than ruins. They become anchor points. And maybe warnings. A whisper through stone, do not forget again, not this time. But will we listen? Or will we do what we've always done? Explain it away, dismiss it, bury it beneath a layer of certainty. The choice isn't made by historians, or governments, or institutions. It's made in moments like this, when someone dares to wonder, when silence becomes a question. Sometimes forgetting is not the result of time, but of design. Not a fading, but a severing. We often imagine memory as something delicate, fragile, subject to decay. But what if memory, true memory, is resilient? What if it fights to remain, only to be repeatedly buried, not by age or accident, but by intention? What if our forgetting was engineered? It's a question that lingers beneath myth. Myth, dismissed as fiction, as symbolic storytelling for primitive minds. But the older a myth is, the more it resists interpretation. It doesn't ask to be understood in literal terms. It asks to be heard like a melody, structured, resonant, layered. And hidden in those layers, something ancient survives. The Sumerians wrote of the Anunnaki, those who came from the sky. The Egyptians spoke of the Neteru, immortal beings who walked among men. The Greeks told of titans who fell, and gods who replaced them. The Norse recalled the Oesir, who brought order after chaos. In the Mahabharata, divine beings ride airborne chariots and wield weapons that split the heavens. Different names, different eras, the same pattern. Beings of light, of knowledge, of power, here and then gone. Were these just metaphors for forces of nature, archetypes of the human mind, or something else? Giorgio de Santillana, a professor at MIT, spent decades studying myth across cultures. In his 1969 book, Hamlet's Mill, he argued that ancient stories encode sophisticated astronomical data, that myths preserve knowledge of the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle over 26,000 years long, something mainstream history claims was only discovered in the last few thousand. But Santillana wasn't a mystic. He was a scholar. His conclusion was simple, unsettling. Myths are not primitive. They are technical, scientific, preserved through story because story endures when stone is broken and books are burned. It would mean that somewhere in the deep past, someone knew, and someone wanted us to remember. But who? And more urgently, who wanted us to forget? The deeper we dig, the more we find signs of abrupt loss. Civilizations rising with impossible speed, collapsing with equal mystery. In Central America, the Mayan civilization flourished for centuries, then, in the space of a few decades, abandoned their great cities. No signs of war, no plague, no resource depletion, just absence. In the Indus Valley, vast cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa boasted grid systems, sewage networks, water purification, and standardized weights. Then vanished. At Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, one of the oldest known cities, walls were covered in murals of celestial events, comets, eclipses, strange lights. Then silence. The idea of sudden collapse repeats so often it becomes rhythm. A civilization reaches a peak, then somehow it forgets. Some blame war, climate, disease, but none of these fully explain the pattern. And so another idea emerges, quieter, less accepted, that these cultures did not forget naturally. They were made to. Not by enemies, not by gods, but by the erasure of knowledge itself. Burn the records, kill the scribes, rebuild the story. And history, like clay, can be reshaped. There is precedent. In 213 BCE, the Chinese emperor Qin Shi Huang ordered the burning of books, philosophical, historical, poetic, anything that did not align with the empire's preferred view. Scholars were buried alive. Records vanished. In medieval Europe, entire libraries were lost to flames, often during wars, sometimes during inquisitions. In one generation, the memory of an entire world could be rewritten. What survives is what is permitted, and what is permitted serves power. So perhaps it was not enough for ancient knowledge to be forgotten. It had to be misremembered. Turn the gods into myths. Turn the engineers into priests. Turn sacred geometry into decoration. Turn cycles into superstition. And what remains? A puzzle with missing pieces, a map with half its landmarks erased. We're told to fill those gaps with imagination. But imagination isn't what built megaliths aligned to star clusters. It isn't what carved thousands of tons of diorite into seamless walls. It isn't what encoded pi, phi, and the speed of light into the dimensions of the Great Pyramid. Imagination doesn't explain that. Memory does. And yet, when researchers find patterns, when someone notices the impossible, they're dismissed. Not for what they say, but for what they challenge. Because the greatest threat to any system is an alternative. To say the past is older than we think is to suggest our understanding is incomplete. To suggest we once had advanced knowledge is to admit we've lost it. To admit we've lost it is to raise an even deeper fear. That we could lose it again. And perhaps that fear is not just theoretical. The more technologically advanced we become, the more vulnerable we are to forgetting. Our knowledge exists not in stone or story, but in silicon, in code, in cloud servers. But clouds can vanish, code can corrupt, power can fail. If a solar flare, a war, or a digital collapse erased our systems, how long would it take before we, too, became a myth? A future generation might find our ruins and say they worshipped screens. And they wouldn't be wrong. They'd find no stone records, no oral chants, only fragments, symbols, data locked in dead machines. And so the cycle continues. Unless we remember differently. Unless we begin to treat the past not as fiction, but as a mirror. Not because we are doomed to repeat it, but because somewhere in it, we may find the key to remembering who we truly are. What if the ancients didn't build monuments to be worshipped, but to wake us? To whisper across time, we were here, you've been here before, don't forget again. What if the greatest lie wasn't about what happened, but about what's possible? They say history is written by the victors, but what's less often said is that it's edited by the survivors, and sometimes curated by those with something to protect. Not treasure, not land, but belief. Belief in what humans are, what we've always been, and what we're allowed to become. We're taught that we emerged slowly, that we struggled into consciousness, discovering fire, wheel, agriculture, like children climbing in the dark. That civilization is fragile, recent, and always improving. But what if that story isn't true? What if we didn't climb? What if we returned. It would explain a great many things. Why the oldest structures are the most precise. Why the earliest myths hold the deepest truths. Why so many ancient cultures seemed to begin, not evolve, but begin already aware. It would also explain why so much has been hidden, not erased, but covered, like a painting buried under newer brush strokes. In China's Shanxi province, near Xi'an, lies something few tourists are allowed to see. A series of massive, forest-covered mounds, pyramidal in shape, aligned with precision. Early Western pilots in the 1940s photographed them. The images showed clearly geometric forms, structures, not hills. One pyramid, known as the White Pyramid, was estimated to be over 300 meters tall, twice the height of the Great Pyramid of Giza. But it isn't part of official tours. It isn't on maps. Satellite imagery is blurred. Chinese authorities call it a natural formation. And perhaps it is, but then why hide it? Across the world, in the Amazon basin, LiDAR scans have revealed vast geometric earthworks beneath the jungle canopy. Circles, squares, massive causeways. Evidence of a networked civilization now completely reclaimed by nature. No records, no preserved writing, but symmetry remains. And symmetry doesn't grow wild. The deeper we look, the more we find signs that the past was not only older than we think, but organized, intelligently, deliberately. Not primitive, but patterned. Which begs the question, how did we become so certain that it wasn't? Because certainty isn't just taught, it's enforced. In school, we memorize names and dates, dynasties and inventions. The Egyptians built the pyramids. The Greeks invented philosophy. The Romans built roads. The Enlightenment brought science. The Industrial Age brought machines. Each age is packaged, labeled, sanitized. But there is little room for wonder, for contradiction, for the strange. You're taught that anomalies are errors, that mystery is confusion, that the past is a solved puzzle. And if you question it, you're dismissed. Not because you're wrong, but because you've disrupted the comfort of the narrative. But comfort is not truth. Truth unsettles, it pulls at threads, and those threads lead somewhere. They lead to temples aligned to solstices, to pyramids that mirror the stars, to monuments that hum with resonance, to stones too heavy to lift, too smooth to chisel, too old to name. They lead to stories that sound like dreams, but echo like memory. And the memory, when you listen close, says, you were more than this. You knew more. You felt more. Not just with intellect, but with intuition. Because what if the ancients weren't only engineers and astronomers, but stewards of something deeper? A form of perception we've forgotten, a way of seeing the world not as object, but as energy. We view the universe as a machine, pieces moving predictably, input and output, cause and effect. But ancient cultures saw it as alive, breathing, conscious. They gave names to stars, rivers, stones, not because they were superstitious, but because they recognized connection. They didn't worship the sun. They aligned to it. They didn't fear death. They prepared for it, architecturally, mathematically, ritually. What if they were trying to tell us that the world itself is layered, that reality has levels, like octaves in sound, and that the structures they left behind weren't buildings, but instruments? Instruments for memory, for navigation, for awakening. It sounds impossible, but only if your idea of possibility has been shaped by limits. We laugh at ancient maps showing dragons and edges of the world, but in our own way, we've drawn the same boundaries. We've declared the timeline fixed, the origins known, the mystery solved. And yet, the mystery refuses to stay silent. It keeps emerging, in stone and soil, in myth and memory, in the feeling that something is missing. That something doesn't add up. Like the giant stone spheres of Costa Rica, perfectly round, placed with purpose, no tools found nearby, no explanation. Or the Coral Castle in Florida, built in the 20th century by a single man, Edward Leeds Skolnin, who claimed to understand the secrets of the ancient builders. He moved multi-ton stones without machinery, worked only at night. Left behind a cryptic message: "I have discovered the secrets of the pyramids." No one ever saw how he did it, and after his death, the method was lost. Again, and maybe that's the story, not of what we've gained, but of what we've lost, over and over. And maybe the greatest loss isn't technology or architecture or history. Maybe it's faith. Faith that something extraordinary once existed, outside our textbooks, outside our narratives, and that maybe, just maybe, it still lives, in the silence of a buried temple, in the hum of a forgotten chamber, in the echo of a story passed in whispers, never written down. So ask yourself, who decided what's real? Who taught you what to dismiss? And what if they were wrong? What if the monuments weren't meant to be worshipped or studied or conquered, but followed? We think of knowledge as something linear, measured, contained in books and degrees, built in towers, stored on servers. But what if the truest knowledge was never meant to be written? What if it was carved into frequency, encoded in silence, stored not in pages but in stone? Ancient structures do not just sit, they resonate. The Great Pyramid vibrates subtly with the Earth's natural frequency, the Schumann resonance, roughly 7.83 Hz infrasound. Low enough that the human ear cannot detect it, but the body can feel it. Deep, subtle, like a presence that doesn't speak but still enters. The King's Chamber is a chamber of resonance, not acoustically ideal by accident, but by intention. Tests have shown that certain frequencies, especially around 110 Hz, create standing waves within the granite walls. These waves don't fade, they build, sustain, interact with the body. Why? What was the purpose of resonance in a tomb? Unless it wasn't a tomb. Unless it was a chamber of transformation, of attunement. In ancient Hindu temples, the placement of pillars and domes creates resonant frequencies when chants are sung. In Tibetan monasteries, gongs are placed to correspond to the chakras of the human body. In megalithic stone circles, like those in Avebury and Callanish, resonance changes as you move. Tones shift, subtly, like music written in space. The ancients did not see sound as background. They treated it as structure. Because to them, sound wasn't just vibration, it was form. Matter responds to frequency. This is no longer mysticism. It is physics. In cymatics experiments, when sound is applied to a plate dusted with particles, those particles arrange themselves into precise geometrical shapes, increase the frequency, and the pattern becomes more complex. These patterns are not random. They follow ratios, harmonics, symmetry. What does this mean? It means that form can be shaped by tone, that structure emerges from vibration. And if that is true, then perhaps the ancients were not building monuments in imitation of the heavens. Perhaps they were creating bridges between states of being, a kind of technology we no longer recognize. Technology that does not rely on combustion, wires, or circuits, but on alignment, intention, resonance. There are ancient stories of levitation, of stones moved with chants, with rhythm, tales from Tibet, Egypt, even medieval Europe. Priests and monks arranging horns in circles, chanting until great slabs of stone floated into place. We dismiss these as metaphor because we don't understand them. But absence of understanding is not proof of impossibility. In the 1990s, physicist John Hutchison conducted experiments with electromagnetic fields. Under specific conditions, small objects appeared to levitate. Metal softened. Material fused in ways that defied known heat or pressure. Was it flawed science or rediscovery? He was dismissed. But then again, so was Tesla. Nikola Tesla believed that vibration was the secret of the universe. That frequency held the keys to limitless energy, to healing, even to consciousness itself. He built devices to harness Earth's natural resonance. His Wardenclyffe Tower was not just a transmission station. It was designed to tap into the planet's harmonic field. The tower was dismantled. His funding disappeared. His notebooks vanished. What did he find? What was taken? Perhaps the reason we do not see ancient technology is because we're not looking for the right thing. We expect engines, wheels, screens, but their machines were not mechanical. They were harmonic. And harmony doesn't leave rust, it leaves pattern. Patterns that repeat across the world, across time, across stone. The number 432 is one such pattern. It appears again and again in the Vedic cycles of time, where the Kali Yuga lasts 432,000 years. In Norse mythology, where 432,000 warriors will march to Ragnarok. The Great Pyramid's base perimeter in inches equals 432 multiplied by 2 tai. The diameter of the Sun is approximately 864,000 miles, 432 x 2,000. The average frequency of the human heart resonates near 1.2 hertz when converted musically, related to AF432 hertz tuning. Modern music is tuned to 440 hertz, but ancient instruments were tuned differently. The lyres of Sumer, the flutes of the Andes, even the earliest Chinese instruments, aligned to 432. Coincidence or memory? Some researchers claim that 432 hertz resonates more naturally with the body, that it creates harmonics in water, in matter, in mind, that it feels warmer, clearer, more aligned. Even if the science is still debated, the presence of the number is not. It's carved into temples, encoded in calendars, built into pyramids, not as decoration, but as signature, a reminder of the underlying rhythm. Because maybe the ancients weren't trying to dominate nature. Maybe they were trying to tune to it. Imagine a civilization that saw everything: sky, stone, breath, thought as vibration. That built in alignment not just with the stars, but with the frequencies of Earth, the sun, the human heart. What would they have been capable of? Would they need engines? Or would intention be enough? We think of advancement as complexity. But sometimes the most advanced systems are the most elegant, the most invisible. The Great Pyramid contains no moving parts, and yet it hums. It has no writing, and yet it speaks. It draws in light, sound, magnetism, heat, and processes them in ways we barely understand. Some say it was a power plant, others an initiation chamber, a stargate, a code. But maybe it was all of these, or none. Maybe its purpose was not to do, but to remind. To awaken in us a sense we've forgotten how to name. Not hearing, not seeing, but resonance. The ability to feel what aligns, what fits, what hums quietly in the soul when something true is near. And maybe, just maybe, the pyramid wasn't built to last forever. It was built to last until we were ready to listen. There is a stillness inside ancient things, not the stillness of time, but of intent, like a breath held, not forgotten, but waiting. What were the ancients waiting for? Maybe for us. Not us as we are, distracted and detached, but for a version of us who could finally listen. Not with ears, but with presence. Because perhaps the greatest structures of antiquity weren't meant to impress. They weren't built for ego, or kingship, or power. They were built to preserve something that words could never carry. A state of being, one that exists beyond language, beyond logic. A resonance that only reveals itself when we are quiet enough to feel it. There is something about the way a pyramid draws your gaze upward. It doesn't demand, it invites. Its lines do not shout, they whisper. Its angles do not instruct, they align. With what? With the stars, with the earth, with us. The more we study these ancient monuments, the more we realize they weren't just aligned to celestial bodies. They were aligned to the rhythms of the self. The Egyptians didn't separate the cosmos from the soul. They believed in Ma'at, a principle that united harmony, truth, and balance. To live in Ma'at was to be in rhythm with the cosmos, and the architecture reflected this. It wasn't just about building large. It was about building correctly. The Temple of Luxor is said to mirror the human body. Its chambers correspond to chakras. The sanctum, the pineal gland. Its proportions reflect sacred ratios found in anatomy, breath cycles, even brain waves. In India, the Brihadiswarar temple was constructed with such symmetry that the sanctum remains cool even under the scorching sun, while the outer stones radiate heat. The layout mirrors the mandalas of Vedic cosmology, microcosm reflecting macrocosm. In Cambodia, Angkor Wat was aligned not only to the sun's path, but to the cycle of Venus, a planet long associated with perception, inwardness, and deep memory. Are these coincidences, or signs of a unified understanding? A worldview where architecture was not an art or a science, but a language, one that spoke not to the intellect, but to the deep awareness sleeping beneath thought. What if the ancients didn't just know where we were in space, but where we were in consciousness? Imagine living in a world where everything, structure, symbol, season, was crafted to reflect back the inner state. A mirrored world, not to distract, but to awaken. Because awakening may have been the real purpose. The pyramids, the ziggurats, the temples, they were not just places of ritual. They were containers of frequency, initiation chambers, transformative spaces. Spaces where the veil thinned. Spaces where memory returned. Not memory of a life, but of being. In the Emerald Tablets, attributed to Thoth, the Atlantean priest king, there is a line. Man is in the process of becoming. Not creating, not inventing, but remembering. Becoming what he has always been, beyond the illusion of separation. This was the heartbeat of many ancient teachings, that the soul forgets as it descends into matter, and that the path home is not outward, but inward. And so they left us not instructions, but invitations, not books, but forms, structures that vibrate with silent truths, truths that can only be heard when the noise of certainty fades. But we weren't taught to enter temples that way. We were taught to measure them, photograph them, catalog them, as if the point was knowledge, when perhaps it was awareness. What happens if you sit in the center of the Great Pyramid's king's chamber, in silence, at night? Some say you feel pressure on your chest. Others report tones, even when none are played. Dreams intensify. Time seems to stretch. The mind does not go blank. It becomes still, as if the chamber is listening, as if it was designed to remember you, the moment you remember yourself. Other ancient sites echo this intention. The Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni in Malta, a subterranean complex over 5,000 years old, contains the oracle chamber, carved so precisely that a male voice chanting at specific frequencies reverberates across the entire complex, triggering sensations in the bones and skin. Why? What was the purpose? Was it worship, or was it tuning? Tuning the human body to the frequency of the earth, or to something beyond? Modern neuroscience is only beginning to grasp how frequencies affect the mind, how certain binaural beats can shift brainwave states, how deep tones can induce altered perception, even healing. But the ancients were already working with these principles. Without wires, without devices, only with shape, stone, silence. What does that tell us? It tells us that technology does not begin with the external. It begins with the inner. That the most powerful machines we could ever operate are the ones within ourselves. The pineal gland, the breath, the nervous system, all responsive, all tunable. And maybe the temples, the pyramids, the towers, they weren't built to reach gods. They were built to help us remember we never lost them. That divinity was never above us, only asleep inside. But sleep has a rhythm, and rhythms can be broken. What happens when a civilization forgets its own vibration? Maybe it begins to build things that don't align. Towers that reach higher but resonate less. Screens that stimulate but never still. Voices that amplify but never echo truth. Maybe forgetting isn't the absence of memory. Maybe it's the presence of noise. And in the midst of that noise, a few things endure. Stone, geometry, silence. Not as accidents, not as artifacts, but as maps. Maps to return, maps to reattune. Because maybe the pyramid wasn't left to impress future archaeologists. Maybe it was left for one reason only, to help us remember how to feel again. What if memory isn't something stored in the mind, but something we're meant to tune into? Like a signal, constant, subtle, always present, but ignored, until we become still enough to receive it. There's a concept in ancient philosophy known as the Akashic field. In Sanskrit, Akasha means ether or sky, not just space, but the substance that holds space together. Some called it the fifth element. Others called it the memory of the universe. The idea was simple, and yet profound. That everything that has ever happened, every word, every intention, every breath, leaves a trace. And that this trace can be accessed, not by reading, but by resonance. That memory isn't gone. It's woven into the very fabric of existence. Maybe the ancients didn't build monuments to preserve information in stone, but to interface with it, to stand at specific coordinates, aligned with stars, tuned to Earth's hum, and remember something larger than thought. The Great Pyramid, when measured to the millimeter, encodes not only terrestrial values, like the curvature of the Earth or its axial tilt, but celestial ones, distances to the sun and moon, the length of the solar year, even the precession of the equinoxes. Too precise to be chance, too universal to be regional. It's almost as if it was meant to reawaken something buried in us, a geometry of memory, a harmonic of truth. And what has buried that memory? Floods, not just of water, but of noise, of destruction, of forgetting. Across nearly every culture, there is a story of a great deluge. The waters rise, the world is swept clean, the few survive, the knowledge is lost. The Sumerians had Ziusudra, the Hebrews had Noah, the Hindus had Manu, the Aztecs had Tata and Nena. Even in the aboriginal dreamtime, the ocean swallows the land in an ancient past. We are told these stories are metaphors, allegories. But what if they are memories? Real, repeated, encoded in story, not for children, but for survival. Because after every flood comes a forgetting, and after every forgetting, a rebuilding. We think we're the first builders, the first to reach the stars, the first to organize cities, to map planets, to split atoms. But perhaps we're not the first, only the latest. The youngest siblings in a family that keeps losing its elders. The more we excavate, the older the story becomes. Pyramids beneath the jungles of Guatemala, roads beneath the oceans off Japan's Yonaguni coast, granite platforms in Baalbek, too large to move even today. And at each turn, we're told, coincidence, natural formation, isolated culture. But nothing about these sites suggests isolation. They are connected, not by language or empire, but by idea, by alignment, by intention. So what was the idea? That question, too simple to be safe, has haunted seekers for centuries. Why did ancient cultures spend lifetimes carving symbols into stone? Why did they carry blocks over mountains, only to bury them in layers of perfect symmetry? Why build in such impossible ways, only to leave behind no names? Maybe because it wasn't about being remembered. It was about us remembering. Not them, ourselves. We think memory is what makes us human. But what if it's what makes us divine? A hidden inheritance, buried not in tombs, but in the quiet core of our being. Something beyond DNA, beyond culture, beyond words. And perhaps beneath the world we've built. A world that accelerates, digitizes, fragments. Where light is artificial, sound is compressed, stillness is rare. Where silence has become so foreign, we fear it. But silence was once sacred. In the temples of Karnak, sound was forbidden in certain chambers, not because noise was rude, but because stillness was the key. The gateway to another perception, a subtler self. A place where memory rose not in thought, but in knowing. What would it feel like? To stand in one of those chambers again, not as a tourist, but as a listener. Would the body recognize the frequency? Would the bones hum? Would the silence crack open something too long closed? Maybe that's what the ancients wanted to give us. Not knowledge, but a key. Not doctrine, but a doorway. Because in the end, truth isn't always something to be taught. Sometimes, it's something to be remembered. And maybe that's why they aligned their temples to the stars, not to worship them, but to remind us that we come from them, that the same patterns shaping Orion's belt are mirrored in our DNA, that the golden ratio flows not just through the Parthenon, but through the spiral of our cochlea, the rhythm of our breath, the structure of our heartbeats, that the cosmos is not out there, it is in here. And perhaps the flood wasn't just about drowning. It was about dilution. Diluting the signal, making it harder to remember who we are. And maybe, just maybe, the time is coming again. Not another flood of water, but of choice. A flood of truth disguised as chaos, of memory disguised as mystery, of awakening disguised as collapse. Because what happens when too many people begin to remember? When they walk among the ruins and feel not curiosity, but recognition? When they dream not of the future, but of a past they've never studied? What happens when the silence between stories grows loud enough to hear? Something stirs. Not in the stone, but in the soul. And maybe that stirring is exactly what the pyramids were waiting for. Not tourists, not fame, but resonance. The moment when enough of us finally ask not what they were, but who we've been. And in that question, softly whispered before sleep, the old world begins to wake. What if the ruins we explore outside are just reflections of the ruins within? We walk among broken stones, toppled columns, eroded glyphs, searching for the past, hoping to uncover what was lost. But maybe what we're really navigating is memory. Not the memory of a world, but of ourselves. Not the kind we store in the brain, but the kind buried deeper. The kind that doesn't speak in language, but in symbols, in dreams, in feelings we cannot explain. You've felt it before, haven't you? A sudden familiarity with a place you've never been. A chill in your chest when you stand near a monolith. The strange sense that the stone is watching. Not with eyes, but with presence. What if those sensations aren't random? What if they're remnants, flashes of something ancient surfacing, a resonance between your body and something left behind? Modern psychology speaks of trauma stored in the body, muscle memory, cellular imprint, epigenetic inheritance, experiences passed down like silent stories, unspoken, but never erased. What if this applies not just to personal trauma, but to collective forgetting? What if the reason we stare into fire, trace spirals with our fingers, stand quietly beneath stars, is because some part of us remembers doing this before? Long before the modern world, before calendars, before borders. There's an ache that lives beneath progress. We build higher, faster, louder, but we rarely ask why it all feels so hollow. We are surrounded by information, but starving for meaning. And perhaps the ancient builders knew that meaning wasn't found in more answers, but in better questions. Why does the same geometry appear across cultures that never met? Why do pyramids rise on every continent, facing the same directions, echoing the same ratios? Why did the numbers repeat? 72, 144, 432, 108, like a hidden rhythm in architecture, music, even the structure of time. We call it coincidence, but coincidence becomes pattern, and pattern, over enough distance, becomes intention. What if these numbers are not just measurements, but mantras, not meant to be solved, but remembered, not by thought, but by presence? Like tuning forks left across the earth, waiting to be struck again. And maybe that's why we're drawn to these places, not for tourism, but for tuning. Because deep down we are instruments too. Our bones conduct vibration. Our hearts beat in time. Our minds move through frequencies we don't yet understand. Science tells us the pineal gland, tucked deep in the brain, contains crystals, that it responds to light, to magnetism, even to resonance. Ancient cultures called it the seat of the soul, the gateway, the eye that sees within. What if the temples and pyramids were built to stimulate this eye, to awaken a perception we've forgotten how to use? It wouldn't require language, only silence, only alignment. But silence is dangerous in a noisy world. It makes space for the one thing the modern mind avoids: remembrance. Because to remember is to feel, and to feel is to reconnect. With pain, with beauty, with mystery. And mystery is uncomfortable. It cannot be mastered, only entered. The ancients seem to understand this. Their myths were not puzzles to be solved. They were thresholds, living symbols. Take the myth of Osiris, dismembered, scattered, reborn, or Inanna's descent into the underworld, or Quetzalcoatl's fall into forgetfulness before his rise. These aren't just tales, they're templates. They echo the same journey: loss, descent, rebirth, the path of the soul, the spiral of remembrance. And in each, a sacred structure appears, not as setting, but as character. A temple, a tomb, a gate. Physical places, yes, but also metaphors, maps for how to return to ourselves. Because maybe the pyramid isn't a building, it's a state. A convergence point between matter and meaning. A geometry of awakening. And maybe the ancients didn't want to be remembered by name. Maybe they wanted us to remember something else. Not who they were, but who we are. Because the greatest secret isn't hidden in stone, it's hidden in us. In the spaces between breath, in the silence between thoughts, in the stillness we've forgotten how to sit with. You feel it, don't you? When you look at the stars too long, when you walk alone through old ruins, when you hear a chant in a language you don't understand, but your body does. A pull, a pulse, as if the past is not behind us, but around us. Waiting! Not to be studied, but to be felt. And maybe this is the reason the structures endure. Not because the builders sought glory, but because they trusted that someday someone would feel what they felt. Not understand it, just feel it. That's enough. That's how memory returns. Not with lightning, but with rain. Not in words, but in rhythm. And so the question shifts from who built the pyramids to who are we when we remember them? Because remembering isn't just about looking back. It's about realigning the present. About stepping back into the frequency where mystery and truth are not opposites, but companions. And in that space, you don't find answers. You find home. What if the world we walk through isn't the only one? Not in the science fiction sense, but in the ancient sense. A world within the world, hidden not by distance, but by perception. The ancients spoke often of the veil, not as metaphor, but as membrane, a thin boundary between what is seen and what is felt. They didn't divide the universe into real and unreal, but into visible and invisible. And sometimes, when the geometry was right, the veil thinned. That's what temples were for. Not places to worship gods, but places to meet them. Not beings with wings or thunder, but states of awareness. Portals not through space, but through the self. In the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, initiates descended into chambers carved in silence. No one was permitted to speak of what they saw. But year after year, the seekers returned changed. The poets said they had seen the end and the beginning, that they no longer feared death. In Egypt, the rites of Osiris promised the same, initiation not as ceremony, but as passage, a death before death, a transformation, a remembering. But these rituals didn't happen anywhere. They happened in chambers shaped with care, aligned with stars, built from stone that hummed. What if these spaces weren't symbolic? What if they were devices, constructed not to impress, but to shift the mind? Because the ancients didn't see the physical and spiritual as separate. They saw them as nested, like layers of music, each vibrating at its own pitch. And to pass between those layers, you needed resonance. We think of temples as structures, but maybe they were frequencies, made solid. Blueprints not for worship, but for return. To what? To a deeper reality, one where the soul remembers its origin. This isn't mysticism, it's physics waiting to be translated. Quantum theory already suggests that particles exist in multiple states until observed, that reality isn't fixed, it's relational. It depends on presence, on attention. So what happens when attention is directed, focused, aligned, through ritual, through geometry, through silence? Maybe reality shifts, not outwardly, but inwardly. And maybe that's why the ancients left no manuals. Because the real technology isn't mechanical, it's perceptual. It's not about what the pyramid does. It's about what it reveals when you are ready. And maybe readiness was the whole point. The Sphinx gazes east, not toward conquest, but toward sunrise, toward renewal. Its face, weathered and timeless, seems less a monument than a sentinel. Watching, waiting. For what? Perhaps for the cycle to return, the cycle of remembering. In nearly every ancient calendar, time is not a line, but a circle. Yugas, ages, wheels, periods of awakening and forgetting, like breath drawn in and let go. We are told these ideas are poetic. But what if they're precise? What if we're not at the peak of human evolution, but at the trough of a much older wave? And what if that wave is rising again? We see it in the questions being asked, not by scholars, but by those who dream, who wonder, who feel. Why are we drawn to the ancient? Why does it feel familiar? Not like history, like memory. And why does it stir something so delicate it almost hurts? It's because we're not just visitors in these ruins. We're participants, walking through echoes, touching shadows. And every step we take near these forgotten alignments, stone circles, sacred groves, old cathedrals, something within us leans forward. Not the mind, the soul. As if to say, I've been here before, but not in this body, not in this time. Still, here. And that's what the ancients may have wanted us to know. That memory is not linear, it is holographic. Encoded not in thoughts, but in patterns, in rhythm, in form. And that the earth itself is a recorder, a keeper of songs too long to hum in one life. The ley lines, the dragon lines, the energy grids. They are not superstition. They are geometry tuned to something just beyond the edge of sight. And the structures placed along them, not accidents, not ornaments, but tuning forks, waiting to be struck, waiting to awaken the symphony. But only when the listener is ready. That's the quiet genius of the ancient world. It didn't broadcast. It waited, because truth spoken too soon becomes dogma. But truth felt becomes awakening. And awakening cannot be taught, only remembered. So here we are, in a world too fast, too loud, too bright. Yet still the old hum continues, in the vibration of a temple floor, in the echo of mantras across mountain air, in the still point at the center of a spiral. The past is not gone, it is folded, waiting for the curious, for the quiet, for the attuned. So ask yourself, what if the pyramids weren't built to house the dead, but to awaken the sleeping? Not in stone, in us. Because maybe the veil isn't something around the world. Maybe it's something between us and who we used to be. And maybe it's already thinning. We look at ancient monuments as things of the past, but what if they're not just remnants, but transmissions? Not frozen in time, still speaking, only we've forgotten how to hear them. We treat the Great Pyramid as silent. But maybe silence was its design. Not emptiness, but resonance. A language that doesn't use words, but waits for recognition. Not from the ears, but from the field of awareness that lives in the body, just beneath attention. So much has been lost in translation. We interpret what we can measure. We discard what we cannot name. And in doing so, we turn cathedrals into museums, sacred sites into photos, and living temples into tourist attractions. But long before concrete and metal, something else was known. Something felt in the skin, in the bones, in the breath when the wind shifts against carved stone. The ancients didn't divide the world between sacred and secular. To them, every place had a frequency. Some were ordinary, and some awakened you. Why build such massive structures, aligned with stars, composed of impossible stone, if the point was only ritual? Why repeat the same forms across cultures, across oceans, across time? Perhaps because the shape itself carried memory. Not memory like we understand it, names, dates, maps, but something deeper, a geometric memory, a vibration that reawakens presence. Presence not as concept, but as state. In that presence, myth becomes map, and myth, so often dismissed, is perhaps the most reliable memory we have. Because myth doesn't ask for belief, it asks for recognition. And when you hear a story about a lost golden age, a fall, a flood, a return, something inside nods. Not the rational mind, something older, quieter. Why does that happen? Because maybe myth is not invented, maybe it is remembered. Over and over again, myth and monument work in tandem, as if one speaks and the other echoes. They don't contradict, they complete. One tells the story, the other holds the silence it lives in. We see this in the myths of Atlantis, Mu, Lemuria, names that drift through spiritual traditions, dismissed by scholars but never quite erased, always returning. Why? Because the symbols are not local, they're archetypal. The sunken city, the sky-fallen god, the temple of vibration, the memory that was buried beneath sand, sea, and self. Even the biblical Tower of Babel carries the echo. Humans once united, building upward, aligned in purpose, until something shattered it. Language fragmented, memory scattered, and the tower, a kind of proto-pyramid, fell. But what if the tower wasn't pride? What if it was frequency? What if the ancients built to reach, not the sky, but a state? And when that state was lost, so was the blueprint. And yet echoes remain. In the sacred numbers, in the ratios, in the resonance chambers beneath forgotten hills. Even now, as we scan the globe with satellites, we are beginning to see it again, a forgotten layer, the ghost map of an earlier Earth. Temples hidden under jungle, roads under ocean, cities beneath cities. A past under the present. A story we weren't meant to erase, but inherit. So what stopped the transmission? Some say it was a flood. Some say it was fire. Others say it was fear. Not fear of destruction, but of remembering. Because when we remember, we change. And change dismantles everything we've been told to build on. Institutions, beliefs, power structures. The ancients weren't just engineers, they were initiates. They knew that memory was not intellectual, it was energetic. To remember was to realign, and realignment can be unsettling. What happens when a society no longer wants to remember? It builds walls around the past. It rebrands myth as fantasy. It fills the silence with noise. But the monuments don't move, they wait. Through conquest, theft, erosion, denial, they endure. Because truth doesn't vanish, it only withdraws, until it is safe to speak again. And maybe it is becoming safe again. Have you noticed? The way more people ask old questions now. The way dreams seem fuller. The way ancient languages and chants stir something, even in those who've never heard them before. This isn't nostalgia, it's resonance. Something is stirring. Not a belief, but a pulse. And that pulse is not coming from the past. It's coming from under our feet, from within our cells, from deep places, once quiet, now beginning to hum. The earth is remembering, and we are part of it. Maybe that's why pyramids point up. Not to escape the earth, but to complete it. To remind us that matter and spirit are not divided, that body and light are not enemies, that remembering is not looking back, but tuning in. And when we tune in, the veil thins, the veil between self and memory, between this life and another, between what we've called ancient and what is, perhaps, eternal. Because maybe the ancients didn't live before us. Maybe they live beside us, in pattern, in silence, in structure, in the way the morning light cuts across a stone lintel, in the feeling that you've been here before, in the breath that catches when a chant you don't understand brings tears to your eyes. You were never meant to forget. You were always meant to wake up slowly, stone by stone, story by story, breath by breath, until the echo inside you became a voice, and the voice a question. One too old for language, but too true to ignore. Maybe we were never meant to find all the answers. Maybe we were only meant to remember how to ask. Not with urgency, not to solve, but to awaken. Because the pyramids were never puzzles, they were mirrors. And in their angles, in their silence, in their refusal to explain themselves, we begin to see the outline of a truth too large for words. Not a sentence, not a doctrine, but a presence. We've traveled far across this memory, through stone and shadow, through myth and mechanism, through sound and silence. And at the center, the question still waits. What if the history we've been taught is not the whole story? We've walked through layers, buried knowledge, encoded mathematics, sacred geometry, strange alignments. We've touched whispers of sound used as force, stone as signal, sky as script. We've seen the same ratios carved into far-flung temples, heard the same stories told by tongues that never met. And all of it leads here, to a still point. Not an answer, but a shift. The ancients knew that memory was fragile, but not because of time, because of us. Because in every age we choose. Do we remember or do we forget? Do we seek comfort or truth? Do we cling to what's safe or surrender to what's possible? We are told to trust the record. But what if the record has gaps, not out of error, but intention? Who benefits when knowledge disappears? When the purpose of pyramids is reduced to tombs, when flood myths are reduced to fiction, when geometry becomes coincidence and resonance becomes superstition, what is lost? Only the past? Or something more dangerous to those in power? Possibility. Possibility that consciousness is more than thought. That memory is more than personal. That history is more than what fits into the timeline we've been given. Possibility that civilization is not a straight line upward, but a cycle, a spiral, a rhythm. A rhythm we've broken before. Maybe the ancients weren't just preserving their story. Maybe they were warning us. Not with fear, but with beauty. Because beauty is harder to erase. We forget names, we burn texts, but we can't unfeel wonder. The awe that still fills our lungs when we stand beneath towering stones. The shiver that climbs the spine when sunlight hits a chamber in perfect alignment once every 1,000 days. The pause that stills the heart when silence echoes back. Something we didn't expect to hear. That awe is the language of remembering. Not remembering who built what, but remembering what we once were. What we still are. Because deep within the noise of the modern world, beneath layers of distraction and denial, something old still stirs. A knowing, a rhythm, a pattern. It's not found in history books. It's not found in debates or titles. It's found in the moment your body recognizes what your mind has been taught to forget. That you are not separate from these monuments. You are not separate from these myths. You are not separate from these cycles. You are part of the pattern. You are written into the code. And maybe the builders of the pyramids, whoever they were, knew this. That the most powerful place to store truth is in the human spirit. That if you encoded it deep enough, in structure, in symbol, in rhythm, it would live. Even if the cities fell, even if the maps burned, even if the timeline shattered, it would live. In dreams. In stories told around fires, in strange questions whispered just before sleep. That is what the pyramids may be. Not declarations, but songs. Built to last longer than memory, built to outlive denial. Not to explain, but to remind. So that when the next age of forgetting came, when the cycle turned again, there would be something left. A compass, a whisper, a shape. To lead us back to the question. The only question that matters. Not who built them, not when, not how. But why? Why did they build something that outlived empires? Why did they embed the stars into stone? Why did they use the same ratios as spiral galaxies, as hurricanes, as the human fingerprint? Why did they leave no name? And why... do we still hear them? Not with the ears, but somewhere else. That is the mystery, not to solve, but to carry. Because maybe we are not the final step in the story. Maybe we are only the next breath. And maybe the monuments are not finished speaking. Maybe they are only now being heard. So if tonight, as you close your eyes, a question stirs, one you've never asked, one you don't understand, one that feels more like music than thought, follow it, not with certainty, but with wonder, and listen, because the stone still sings.